Hey guys, what's up? This is Alex Duque. Welcome back to another exciting and simple tutorial. Let's today we're talking a little bit about materials and mapping. Just some basic things before I get any more in detail. Just FYI, I got a area light and a polyplane, and the area light has, hopefully, it has shadows, ray trace shadows. Let's just double check on that. Let me move out of here. There we go. Use ray trace shadows. I'm going to give it some rays. Okay, so we got a light and we got an object. That way we got some, whenever we make a render. And actually, let's go ahead and make a camera and aim as well. So whenever we are to, I'm putting my camera against, in the opposite direction of the light, so that when we talk about specularity, we're actually able to see some specularity. Okay, so nothing complicated, nothing fancy, very simple scene, and just some basic general knowledge or general things that you should not do. One thing you should never do is change the Lambert one. Okay, reason being is because that one gets automatically assigned to any object that you make. So if you change something on that Lambert one, anytime you make a new object, that's going to be mapped. I'm going to give you an example of doing things the wrong way. Suppose that you're going to map a checker onto this polyplane. So you would select the attributes and you'll go into the Lambert 1 option and you'll see the color, and then you're gonna map a checker, and there's the checker, and then you're like, yeah, that's awesome. But then you go ahead and make yourself a sphere and you're like, oh my god, why does it have the same thing assigned to it? The reason being is because that one got assigned the Lambert 1 and you mapped something onto Lambert 1. So make sure you don't change any properties on Lambert 1. You keep that one default. And this brings me into how to assign materials into objects. Whenever you need to assign a material into an object, you got choices. First way you can do things is select the object, right click, assign new material, and select the material that you're going to assign. So I'm just going to do it, new material there, and I'm going to go and make a blend. So that's one way of assigning a material. Another way of assigning a material is by creating it and middle mouse drag and dropping it on the actual object. A third way of assigning a material is by selecting the object and right clicking on the material that you're going to assign, and then assign material to selection. Alright, so that's just some ways of assigning materials to objects. You can also select faces and then right click on the material that you're going to assign and assign material to selection. So those are just some ways of assigning. Okay, now if you have unused shaders on your scene, or unused textures or unused stuff, you can hit edit on the hypershade. You can hit edit and then delete unused nodes, and it's going to delete anything that's not mapped onto something else. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a render of our camera 1 here, and by default this is what we are getting. Now, as far as materials go, you can create materials by going into the hypershade and looking under surface, and you'll have some of the default materials on there. These are the default Maya materials. And if you want to create mental ray materials, you can switch your tab to create mental ray nodes or create all nodes. I'm going to create all nodes, that way I can see my mental ray and my Maya information here. But so you go all the way down and you'll see a tab that says materials. Usually that's not unlocked, it's like locked like that. So you'll see that tab that says materials, and if you open that, then you'll see a whole bunch of mental ray materials on there. Now, these little arrows are kind of handy if you can't read and you want to be able to see, so you can click those to make it bigger and smaller. So let's talk about the basic materials. In Maya, as far as materials go, there is Lambert, there are blends, there are fungs, there are fungies, and there are anisotropics. As you can see, I'm skipping some materials, but I'm purposely doing it like that because these are the most basic materials in Maya. You got the Lambert, and you got the fung, and the blin, and the fungi, and the anisotropic. Now the main difference between these guys and this is that the Lambert is not a specular material, whereas all the other guys are specular materials. Whenever a material is specular, it also comes with a tab for reflectivity. Now I'm not going to get in details, but I will give you an overview of, or let's just say like a basic understanding and difference between specularity and reflectivity. In real life, objects can be thought of as not being specular, but being reflective. They would reflect light. Some are going to have very little amount of reflectivity, and that reflectivity is going to be very blurred. And some objects are going to have a lot of reflectivity, and that reflectivity can be very sharp. So something, let's say for example, a material that has very blurred reflectivity can be, let's say for example, brushed metal. For example, that can be, it has the reflections that you see on it are very blurred, so you don't see any detail on it. And its complete opposite would be a mirror that is very reflective, but the reflectivity is very sharp. But in Maya you have both options. You have the option of reflectivity and specularity, and you just gotta know which one you want to be using. Okay, so as I was saying, Lambert doesn't have the specularity information, and the other guys do. Now, Lambert can be thought of as, for example, like paper or cardboard, or even like concrete if it's not a reflective type of concrete or a specular type of concrete. Fungs can be thought of for materials like plastic, for example. Blend can be thought of as like metal. Fung E is sort of like a happy mixture between, or not a mixture, but it's trying to make a fung behave a little bit more like a blend. So it's like a fung that works for metal looking surfaces. And the anisotropic, if you can see the highlight, see how it's like a blurred, it's like a stretched out, distorted highlight. So that would be like brushed metal, for example, or water or hair. That it would have variation in its highlight, therefore it has that form. Um, so let's assign this Lambert 2 onto this plane, and I'm gonna make a render, and I'm gonna keep it. So you'll see how that looks by default. Now I'm gonna assign the fung, and I'm gonna make a render, and you'll see how it looks by default. And now I'm gonna assign the blend, and I'm gonna make a render, and you'll see how it looks by default. And I'm going to select my fung E and assign it, make a render, and you'll see how that looks. And the anisotropic, and you'll see how that looks. So you can see the differences between them. This being the Lambert, that would be the fung, that would be the blend, that would be the fung E, that would be anisotropic. Okay, now as I said, by default they have reflectivity. We're not seeing any reflectivity here because there's no other objects on the scene. If there were another object, or was another object on the scene, then any specular material is going to reflect that object. So we got a shadow. Actually, I'm going to change the angle of my camera here a little bit. assign my font there, and you can see there's the reflectivity, there's the shadow, and there's the specular highlight. Now, when we go to materials, why don't we go ahead and start by talking about the Lambert, since it's the simplest one. On the Lambert, you'll find these basic attributes: color, transparency, ambient color, incandescence, bump mapping, diffuse, translucence, translucence depth, translucence focus. I'm not going to talk about the translucence attributes right now, since we can do that a little bit later in another tutorial. But let's talk about some of the main ones, which are color, transparency, and diffuse. Well, an ambient color, and incandescence, and bump mapping. Might as well include them. As far as color goes, it's pretty self-explanatory. Dark color, white, bright color, red color, and any change you make, you'll see its behavior. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Transparency would make the object transparent or not. So now we're going to be able to see through it. Now, because there's nothing behind it, it's going to be a little hard to see through it. So why don't we go ahead and just make another primitive, and I'm just going to make it like that, making sure it's underneath. So you can see, you can see behind it. So pretty self-explanatory there. The ambient color is whenever that comes into play more when you don't have any global illumination or bounce of light. This can achieve a result of an object, of a surface, being a little bit brighter, so its light is transferred throughout the object rather than be more lit on one area and more dark on other areas. The incandescence would make this object be more like self-emitting, like if it was emitting light. So if I wanted the result to be a little bit more real, it might be a good idea to have a light underneath to get a result, or have final gather, and then you really see the incandescence. But again, think of incandescence as having the object be self-illuminating. Then we have bump mapping, which I'll talk in a little bit. Diffuse would make the object have more diffuse transfer through, or more diffuse transfer through in the case of it being higher, or less diffuse transfers through, which would make it darker. And translucence, just so you know, would make it transparentish. Not really in this case, we're not going to see the transparency. We would actually see it if we had a light behind it. Let me just go ahead and make a light here, or just duplicate this light. So I'm going to put this light behind over there, and you can see that the shadow of that object being cast onto this object, you can actually see it. That's why it's translucent. An example of translucent object can be like a piece of paper, for example. If you put a piece of paper against a light, and then you put your hand between the paper and the light, you'll be able to see like the shadow of your hand on the paper. So that would be an example of translucency. And so I'm just going to add that there. But for now, we're going to keep that 0. Now, yeah, no, it's I'm going to keep it like that on the Lambert, and move and talk a little bit more with another material. So for example, the Fong. So here's the Fong, and you can see the highlight of my light right there. If I made my light source smaller, and therefore I would have to increase its intensity a little bit more. a little bit more. Okay, so as you can see right now, there's my light and there's my object, and my camera is looking perpendicular to the light. Now in the case of the Phong, you have these values called cuisine power. If that value is really high, then the specular highlight of that light is going to be more less blurred and more sharp. And you're not constrained to 100. I can actually make it like 600, for example. So it's going to be really sharp. And now you can see a little bit better the shape of my sphere, of my light source. Let's get up to 1000 and see if we can get even more. Okay, so that's as far as we can get there. Now the specular color is the color of that highlight. So although our light is white, if I change the specular color to, let's say, red, then the specular color is now going to be red. And if my cuisine power is really low, it can only go down to 2, then I'm going to get a really broad specular highlight there. So I'm going to keep some renders. Let me just delete some old renders here. Okay, so I'm going to make a render with a really low cuisine power and a really bright specular color so that we can really see it. Keep that image and let's make it 5, or actually let's make it 25. Keep that image. I kept it twice, figures. So at 25, let me keep that image. At 50 and render, and let's keep that image, and at 100 and render and keep that image, and at 300 and render and keep that image, and I'm going to make it 1000 and render. Now this will allow you to see what's happening. You can see how the specularity, or the reflection of the light source, gets to be more precise or sharper as the cuisine power gets higher and higher and higher. Now since we're talking about those two guys there, why don't we go ahead and assign the blend, and if we select the blend, you'll see the same attributes as before, except here you have two values, eccentricity and specular roll-off. Now the eccentricity controls the size, the overall size of the highlight, and the specular roll-off controls the intensity of that highlight. I can make it really small with a very high specular roll-off. So if I make a render right now, let me just make sure I keep that one. Then you can see a very, very specular reflection of my light source. And I'm gonna again keep this image. I'm gonna keep this image, and I'm gonna increase the eccentricity just a tad, and make a render, and keep that image, and increase that a little bit more, and make a render, and keep the image, and increase it a little bit more, and make a render, and keep the image, and increase it a little bit more, and make a render, and keep the image. So this allows you to see the same effect, this time on a blend. You can see how sharp it can get, and how low, how blurred or how big it can get. Whereas with the Phong, as far as sharpness, that's pretty much as sharp as you're gonna get. Whereas with a blend, you can get a little bit more sharp, and you can also get a little bit more soft than with Phong. So it's got a broader spectrum. And of course you also have the specular roll-off, so it allows you to control the intensity of that highlight. So I can make it still be big, but it's not as pronounced. And this plus the specular color can add up. So if I give it a white specular color and a really low specular roll-off, then it's going to be very soft. But if it's white on white, then it's going to burn. So if we make it like that, but very, very small, then we're going to get a very bright, very sharp specular highlight. Okay, So let's go ahead and move onto the func E and talk about the same attributes here. Here instead we have roughness, highlight size, whiteness, specular color, and reflectivity. Now the reflectivity, sorry, we're not talking about that yet, but we have the roughness and the highlight size. Now the highlight size is the size of the highlight, as obvious as it sounds. And the roughness is how sharp or how soft that highlight can be. So it can be really big, really rough, really sharp, or really small, really sharp, like so. Let's increase the highlight, let's decrease that to 0.01 and make a render. But you got an extra control to this, which is the whiteness and the specular color. So if we give it whiteness, then it's going to be a little bit brighter, and of course we multiply that with the specular color and it's going to be even a little bit more bright. Let's see how sharp we can get there. You can see that's pretty much as sharp as we're going to get. Now let's try a little bit more, 0.0001. I don't know if that is even going to show, but we're going to give it a shot. There you go. You can see it's really specular, but it can go from very specular to its complete opposite, to very soft. Take that whiteness down, and we're going to get a little bit softer on that. So as you can see, they pretty much do the same. It's just they have different values of being controlled. The one that's a little bit different than these three guys is the anisotropic. And if we go ahead and assign the anisotropic, this is what we're going to get by default. Now as far as the specular shading, this has a lot of controls. It's got an angle, a spread on X and Y, or we can call that on V. It's got roughness, Fresnel index. Now the angle would be the angle of the highlight. So if we say 180, we're gonna get that, and you can see this is gonna roll around. Actually, let me delete all my old renders. And take the angle back down to 0. Make a render. Keep it. And we're gonna have 25 degree increments here. So that's at 25. Keep it. This is at 50. Keep it. Did I keep the other one? Yeah. Keep that one. And at 75, render. Keep it. Then at 100, render. Keep it. Then at 125, render. Keep it. Then at 150, render. Keep it. Then at 175, render. Keep it. And at 200, render. And keep it. And at 225, render and keep it. And at 250, then render and keep it. And at 275, render and keep it. And at 300, render. And I think that's more than enough. So you can see its progress there. You can see how by changing the angle, we are changing how it's how the light's being transmitted. If you look at a blurred metal, brushed metal, for example, or some types of metals, you'll actually see how the highlight just extends down on the surface. So that's just this material is a material that can help you to achieve that result quickly, as far as specular shading goes. Now then you have the spread X and Y, which is how sharp or how soft this highlight can be. So you can see on the X what that's doing, and if I do it on the Y, then you can see that it begins to get a little bit more round. Let's take that all the way to 100%. So you can see that's pretty much what we originally had from our other renders. Let me just delete all these images here. Let's go ahead and do. Okay, and so again, if you take those values down, then it might be a little too much, but let's see what happens. There we go. So you can see the curvature that it's giving us. And the roughness is how rough this highlight would be. So it can be really rough or more subtle. Now the Fresnel index is, it has to do with the degree of incidence of the light and its direction. But to put in simple terms, because I think this attribute should be more considered in simple terms, it can be softer or sharper. So it's sort of like the more intense and less intense that highlight will be. So less intense and more intense. And the specular color is sort of like the same thing, because if it's really bright, then it's really intense. So if I keep my Fresnel index really low, then it looks soft, but the specular color is intense. So I hope that more or less helps to explain some of these values. And that's just some of the the main attributes for the main objects in here. If we go back to our Fong, and I like Fongs more personally, don't ask me why, I just like them. We can go ahead and map. We're gonna make a little connection here. Nothing complicated. We're gonna start by mapping color. So if you need to map color, you got different ways that you can map it. You can click on the little checker box right there, which is going to open up the create render node, where you can select from a whole bunch of textures. You can also look at your textures on the hypershade down here, and you can just middle mouse drag and drop onto the work area of the hypershade. Let me undo that. Or you can click the actual texture that you want to assign, and it's going to be on the work area as well. That's another way. And then if you need to link it to let's say to the Fong, you can either middle mouse drag and drop it on the attribute editor on the channel that you want to map it to, or you can middle mouse drag and drop it on the material, and then you'll see your selections right there. So I don't know, I'll leave it up to you on how you want to create it, but go ahead and let's create a grid. We're doing that's a 2D texture. There's 3D and 2D textures in Maya, and then there's files, but for now we're just gonna worry about 2D textures. So go ahead and make a grid and map the grid onto the color, and if we make a render, hopefully we'll end up getting something that looks like this. So it's a very nice and reflective grid floor. Now what's cool here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do something very simple, just like bathroom tiles. Why not? Yeah, bathroom tiles, they sound cool. So that way we can talk about a whole bunch of attributes, and these are just the main things that I want you to learn, which is how to map color, how to map bump, and even mapping specular color. If you think of an object, like we talked about, the Lambert doesn't have any specularity. So if I actually take the specular color down on this Fong, then there's no specularity. And if it's all the way white, then there's a lot of specularity. And what's cool as well is that there's a connection or a correlation between specular color and reflectivity. If the reflectivity is 1 and the specular color is 0, then that surface is not reflective. Okay, so I mean, that's just the way it is. I'm gonna go ahead and show this other light, and I'm gonna give this sort of like a bounce light here. Let's make a render just to see it. That way you get a little bit of an extra amount of shading here. It looks a little bit nicer that way. Might as well delete that guy there. Okay, so we got a Fong, and the Fong is assigned onto the floor. And why don't we assign the Lambert onto the sphere? And let's start by making our Lambert just white with a diffuse of 1, so it's nice and bright. And now let's select our grid and let's make the filler. For now we're gonna make it gray. I'm sorry, the filler we're gonna make like a blue. Let's make it a bluish white, and the line we're gonna make it a gray. So it's not gonna look like much, but it will look like something. And make sure that we have a lot of specular color, so it's white, and that the reflectivity is all the way set to 1. And that this way I can show you the reflectivity. This is the material, this is the highlight of the light, and this is the reflectivity of the material. Okay, so as you can see, we have reflective and we also have specular. Of course, or although in real life this is not 100% accurate, if that is the highlight of the light, it's that soft, and theoretically the reflections on here should also be soft. But for now we're gonna keep it like that, and we're just gonna go with it. So we have a grid, and the grid is assigned onto the color of our Fong, and that's groovy doovy because we get color and we get reflections. But the thing is that we're gonna start by playing a little bit here, and we're gonna change the color of our of the creases of our tiles, so that there's something mapped onto them. So if we select the grid, we can again map anything anywhere. We can actually map on the line color any texture that we want. So we're gonna map a fractal for now. And if we make a render, then we're gonna get like a fractalish texture on the lines. Now we're going to change the level minimum to 10 and the level maximum to 15. So by doing that, we're gonna have a little bit more detail on the on this fractal, and we're also going to increase the ratio of it, and hopefully that's gonna give us just enough detail. Yep, that sounds good there. So now we got a little bit more detail, and we can actually get even more detail by selecting what's called a placement node. So if you, let's organize this a little bit. If you look at the fractal and you look on the tabs, you'll see a place 2D texture. Now if you can't see it here in the hypershade, you got these little 3 icons. This one shows input connections, this one shows input and output connections, and this one shows output connections. On the options, you have clear before graphing. That way we can uncheck this, so that when we select the fractal and show the inputs and the outputs, it'll show everything. Oh, here it is. That's why it's not showing it. Then it's not going to delete all the other stuff, because if that was on and I selected the fractal and I did input and output connections, then everything gets deleted. So I already deleted everything, so I'm just gonna keep it like that. But anyway, it's a good idea to keep that off. Now you have this place 2D texture, and on that place 2D texture you have some extra attributes, and one of them says repeat U and V. So if you repeat, you can repeat this texture 20 times, so it's actually going to repeat a whole bunch of times, so it's really noisy, which is sort of like what we're looking for here. Now we got the grid and the fractal connects to the grid, and the grid connects to the Phong. Now if we go back to our grid, we're not going to do anything on the filler color, although we could. But for now, we're going to keep our filler color let's just keep it how it is. And that pretty much takes care of the color mapping of this, but you know, it's still kind of sucky. So why don't we go ahead and give this more detail, like bumpiness, like, you know, so that it looks more real, like the tiles are coming out and the creases are going in. Now for us to do that, the best thing we can do is, well, we got two choices. We can make another grid, or we can duplicate this grid. Because making another grid is very obvious, I'm just going to select this grid and say edit, duplicate, and this allows me to talk about these three guys. When you duplicate shading network, it's going to duplicate the grid and the whole shading network. So pretty much all these guys are going to get duplicated. Without network, it's only going to duplicate the grid. And with connections to network, it's going to duplicate the grid and anything that connects to it. So it won't, or it would duplicate the grid, and it would make a duplicate of this little arrow. So it actually duplicates the connections that goes to it. So if we do that last one, you'll see what I'm talking about. So it's duplicating the grid, but it's keeping the connections. And if we show the inputs of that grid, you'll see that the place 2D node is being shared also by both grids, which is kind of cool, because if I tell this place 2D to repeat not 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, but let's say 2 times, then it's changing on both grids at the same time. And that's important because we're about to do bump mapping. So if we select our grid 2, we change our filler color to white, and we assign this grid onto the bump mapping of our Phong. It's a little bit too pronounced, so we can barely see it. But there's actually bump mapping now. I don't know if you can see this little highlight there. Let's pronounce that a little bit more. Let's get rid of the grid color connection. If you select the actual line and delete the line, we can tell the line to be black. So maybe that will allow us to see it more clear. So you can see that this is bumping up, and wherever it's bumping down in some other areas. And we can actually have it be more. There's a bump value right there, and you can increase or decrease the bump depth. So if you increase the bump depth, let's say 5, just a lot right now, you'll be able to see that that bump might exaggerate. Let's keep that image, and I'm going to decrease it to 1. So you can see a little comparison there of more and less bumpiness. And let me put my camera a little bit more like this and see what happens. Okay, so a little bit more like that then. Okay, now bump maps are usually created to cheat the effect of a surface of a surface detail. Now, of course, because it's a cheat, you can do it with something that's massive. So like these tiles are really big, for example. If we wanted to have really small tiles, let's go from 2 to 8 by 8. Then we're going to have smaller tiles. So that effect is going to be more pronounced now. You can see it there now. You can see that it gives you the idea of there being more detail. Now, we can actually make a duplicate as well of our fractal. So we can say edit duplicate with connections to network, and we can map this second fractal to the line color. And the reason why we did it like that is so that we can keep the amount of duplication, but under color balance we can take the color gain and make it lesser. The basics about bump is that black is going to push down, white is going to push up. So now we're getting a little bit more detail on our bump. Hopefully you'll be able to see it there. Now we can even get a little bit more. We might as well give it a shot. This bump is like really sharp. We're gonna try and soften that bump up. There's different ways we can do that. If we select the bump under effects, there's a value that says bump filter, and if we increase that bump filter, I don't know if this is gonna be enough, but if we increase that bump filter, then it's gonna soften up a little bit. You can see it now there. So if I make it like 5, for example, it's gonna be a 5 pixel filter on the bump, so it's gonna really filter out. So you can see how it's now looking different. That's one way of filtering or softening the bump. Another way is by actually, for example, either blurring the image, or blurring the actual texture. If we select our grid here, we have our grid. There's an option that says color balance, and underneath it there's effects. Under effects there's a filter value, and that is also a way to soften this. So if I give it a 5, then it's going to soften up by 5 pixels this grid, which is, as you can see, going to soften up the bump. And we can keep playing with these values, but like I said, I'm trying to keep it simple. And even if I'm keeping it simple, it's still a little bit complicated probably. So anyway, so we got bump and we got color, and if we want to, we can go ahead and map specularity. So what is that happens in real life? The tiles are made of like marble or something that's reflective, and what's it called, the creases are not supposed to be reflective. They're supposed to be more dull. And one way that we can achieve that is by making yet another grid. So if we were to select our grid 2 and say edit duplicate with connections to network, then we have a third grid, and that third grid we can map onto the specular color. So that way, whatever's white is going to have a lot of specularity, and whatever's black is not going to have specularity, or is going to have a very little amount of specularity. So hopefully we'll be able to see it here, where the creases are dulling out. Now if we actually disconnect the grid, the fractal to this third grid, and make sure that the filler color, that the line color is black, then what we're gonna end up getting is it's a dulled out crease. Okay, so that's one way to map things. Now I'm gonna just make a recap on a very simple, with the same thing, just a very simple example. I'm gonna make myself another font. So again, this is recap. If you want to stop, you can stop, but you can watch this recap in case you didn't get it. I'm gonna make a font, and I'm going to make a grid and going to assign the grid to the color of the font and assign the font onto the plane there, and just gonna make sure that this is not so small. Just gonna make it bigger so it's really obvious, 2 by 2, and make a render, and this is what we're gonna get. Now if I'm going to keep that image, I'm going to make a render with that nothing connected to the font. That's what you get. I'm going to make this not to a color but to the bump. So this is what you're going to get. Bumpiness. And I'm going to make another render so it is back to default, and I'm going to map this into the specular color. And so what's going to happen is that whatever is black is not specular, whatever is white is specular. And therefore you can go ahead and mix and match and connect a whole bunch of attributes. So that is the main foundation. So I hope you didn't get too confused on this tutorial. Just keep in mind that you can map things to different things, and that you can duplicate with connections to network, and that you can map anything to anything. Alright, so I'll see you with the next tutorial, and we'll talk about transparency mapping and its effects. Okay, so I'll see you. Bye bye.